So, before we take a look at the actual shading part of the model and open the hypershade and take a look at the shaders and in fact that little uh, thing I mentioned during the rigging series. So let me just show the controllers again, the shading control. And before continuing, let us also just regenerate all those UV tile previews. So we might want to take a look at something in the viewport here. And enable all lights actually, so just to make it appear a little bit nicer. So these are the textures that I used, but only very few of them. So there's this thing that you can, of course, display Arnold shaders in Maya's viewport, and they work fine. Actually, they actually look pretty good. So they're what's doing these reflections here and stuff. So that's not that much of a problem if you're using simple texturing. However, as soon as you start to use procedural noises or anything that Maya can't display in the viewport, your object will usually turn either black or orange or some other color, because that's basically Maya's way to tell you that it can't display what is currently being fed to the shader input. So Maya can, of course, display an Arnold standard surface shader's diffuse color, and it can display it if it's just connected to your file texture or something like that, or one of Maya's own shading nodes. But of course, if you're using an AI noise or something like an AI curvature or something like that, so something that is computed by the actual renderer, of course, Maya has no idea what that thing is or how to calculate that, so you can't display it in the viewport. So the way around this is that this model is using some specific viewport shaders were specifically set up, that are specifically set up to display some parts of the textures to get a general idea of the mesh in the viewport as well. And I'll take a look at that later. But yeah, there's much more to it than you can actually see here. So basically, it's just the diffuse color of things, and that's it. But let's take a look at the textures first. So I'm gonna open that folder and quickly tell you about them. This is the folder containing all of the textures used by the fuselage, or rather said, the main mesh of the of this plane. There are, of course, also cockpit textures, so they're in a different folder. And the pilot texture, actually, so most of him is just using simple shaders, but he has a face, so there's a baked texture for that because that was done from a scan mesh. So let's go into the UDIM load here. So that's the folder where I'm grabbing the files from at the moment. So of course, all these TX files you can just ignore them. They're just Arnold's own texture format, so it's going to convert your textures to TX at render time, and will regenerate them if something has changed on the texture. So what I'm loading here are the actual JPEG files. So I normally on production you'd probably use EXR files, even as a texture input, so you always render out EXR, and really if you're rendering into any other format, don't. So I don't know, but I think that pretty much for everything I've rendered for the last, whatever, 10 years, 12 years, maybe even more, can't really remember. Don't even remember how old OpenEXR is now. But, well, for the majority of doing CG, I've never ever, again, rendered anything into any other format than EXR, because, well, in the end, you can work super comfortably with them in Uke, and there's really just no reason to render out in any other format. So use OpenEXR, and you may use OpenEXR as a texture input, but usually. So if you're on production, you will probably have these textures maybe in sRGB, so of course JPEGs are used on production as well, depends on the thing, but usually if it's painted or done in Mario or something, it will usually be an EXR file. It might be, instead of sRGB, it might directly have been done in ACG as a color space. But in the end, for most things, a JPEG texture is actually enough. So I tend to use them for some personal things. For other things, I usually use an EXR or maybe a TIFF file. Really, this doesn't really, this texture hasn't really any attributes where I'd consider using anything else than a JPEG, because, well, there's really not that much color finesse there that you need a floating point format or even 16-bit really. Of course, if this thing had displacement or something like that, I would, of course, use 32-bit or 16-bit half EXRs as a displacement map, because you need that color definition there, because you see banding if you don't. Other than that, well, the JPEGs are small on the hard drive, which doesn't change anything about the fact how large they are at render time, by the way. So you can see those TX files are quite large. So even if those JPEGs are small on your hard drive, that doesn't mean that they are any easier on the renderer. So all that color information that's basically compressed in a JPEG has to be decompressed again, and the renderer basically just reads the pixels and maps them into memory and reads them from there. So in the end, it's always just your bit depth and your pixel size that defines how large a texture is in memory. So there's really nothing you can change about that. So that's just about some hard drive space, and really don't care whether it's JPEGs or TIFFs. Whatever works in that case, if you're working in 8-bit anyway, and for that plane, as I said, it really didn't matter. It could have worked in 16-bit in Photoshop if I wanted to, but really, nah. You can see that there are a few UDIM things, actually. So there are even a few more textures that don't actually belong to that plane. So in the shots, there are a few planes. So some of these UDIM tiles actually get replaced on certain meshes. So there's this one is called Miss Elliot 2. That's kind of like my main thing, but in the background there's also another plane, and I've called that Furious Frenzy, and there's another plane that's just called Lady Fiona. So they're not actually based on any real existing P51D. Of course, the color scheme and things like that, they're of course based on real planes, but there was never a plane called Miss Elliot or a Furious Frenzy or Lady Fiona. Well, maybe there was, but my plane is not based on them. So yeah, the tail number is fictional. Because I kind of like, yeah, when you're modeling, you sometimes kind of like have the story in your head of the background of the plane, who flew that thing, what kind of life it has, the object that you are building. And well, kind of like, I find it kind of like limiting in a way to have a real story as a background, because you're kind of like in your thoughts you're pushed to that. And maybe it's because I do a lot of sci-fi modeling, where kind of like I usually kind of like imagine stories in my head while creating the thing. It kind of felt natural to just use a plane that never existed, because, well, then the stories are endless. So well, that's a personal thing, but I guess everyone who creates things in CG kind of like tends to imagine some little stories around the things they are building. So yeah, that's kind of like the reason why I decided to just, well, base the plane on real reference footage. And actually the tail number might exist, so that might actually be a real different plane in reality, but there was never a Miss Elliot, at least as far as I know. So that's the three names of the plane, as I've called them. But really everything else, or even that fuse text 1001, so basically the left side texture here, that's our Miss Elliot here. So let's take a look at the file. So there's this albedo map, there's this bump map, there's this dirt mask, there's this metal color, there's this metallic map, and that's basically it. So for each and every one of them, or not every one of them, but most of them, so the bump and the albedo go to 1005, The dirt mask and the metal color just go to 1004, which isn't a problem. You can set the default color for everything that is not mapped by a UDIM tile, so wherever that thing is not. So if the renderer sees, well, this goes to 4, but there's no UDIM tile 5, you're just going to use your default color, so you can tell it to just use black or just use white, depending on what you need. So missing tiles are not a problem. I could have for some reason not have tile 1002 and 3 on the dirt mask if I didn't need that, so that's okay. So what are they? So the albedo is our actual diffuse color. So albedo is basically the thing that, how much light and what color of light the thing reflects. So basically just the diffuse color of the plane. Now, there's this thing, let me just zoom in here, and really that's not much of a complex texture because honestly most of it is empty because most of the plane is metal. So basically the only things that actually have any texture information are these colored bits, and that's not that complicated actually. But that's enough actually. So a few parts of the plane are just painted material, and this texture is also mixed with some procedural textures, so that simple color texture basically works. And as I said, most of this is pretty much empty because there's metal on the plane anyway. So this is basically this shader that is using that texture is only ever being applied to parts of the plane that have this paint material. So if I take a look at another thing, I'm going to take a look at this fuse text 1001 metallic. So this is basically a mask texture. So they are all generated from the same file, so per UDIM. So this is just black and white information that I'm basically using later to tell the shader where it's basically metal or where it's a painted material. So the painted material is just pretty much a standard, almost plastic material, really. And there's also this, So there's also this mask to kind of control where the thing is metallic and where it's painted. So the next thing is the metal color. So this is basically just a map for the metal parts of the plane. And since some things like the rivets are darker, they're metal but darker than the rest of the plane. So basically everything is white here, and then there's some dirt mixed in here to kind of like break up the color of the plane here and there. And there's a little bit of this engine dirt stain here, right around here where the exhaust is, just a little bit. But mainly this is just used to basically color the rivets on the thing. And if I close that down, please do that, Windows. So if I then look at the dirt mask for tile 1001. This is basically a mask for yet another shader on the whole plane. And basically this is the texture for this big engine oil and dirt stain on the side of the plane. So the exhaust is of course kind of like wearing down the surface of the plane in these areas. And there's actually a lot of variation. Nowadays, P51s are pretty clean, and if I left out all those textures and just used some metallic material and some bump on the plane, it would actually pretty much look like a modern P51 that's maybe been restored or something like that. But really, back in World War II, those things were pretty dirty. So they were of course pretty much shiny when they came from the construction facility and were maybe shipped to Europe. But usually after some time in the war and usage, those things would wear down, so some panels or the surface of the plane wouldn't become as shiny as it was before, and also there would be dirt everywhere, so some corrosion and stuff like that. So this is more, since I wanted to do a plane as it looked in World War II and not a clean modern representation of a plane, and just because it's more fun to paint actually, I decided on a dirty version. So basically that's that. This is just controlling where the plane is dirty, hence dirt mask. So the last thing for tile 1001 is the bump map. So this is gray at its base, neutral gray. So I can have things that are protruding outside and inside the surface. So basically those darker parts are pushing into the surface, those lighter parts are pushing out of the surface. And basically that's just the rivets. There's a few more things, some hatches to access things, some little details here and there and stuff, but basically that's just rivets. So these ribs on the tail that are pretty prominent on the real plane, of course, and stuff like that. But basically, that's just black and white height information, and that it, of course, exists for all the other UDIM tiles as well. So if I just go quickly through here, you can see the same thing for the other side of the plane. The wings, some that's actually the propellers and the stabilizers, although you wouldn't be able to tell that from that texture. So the bump maps for everything, really, that's just the fuselage and the wings. Then the dirt maps for everything. So basically, it's also just the fuselage and the wings and stuff like that. And then the metallic masks for all the parts of the thing. And of course, this is Furious Frenzy. So another plane, which is not our Miss Elliot, which we're taking a look at. So while I'm here, I might as well just open this up. So this is a cockpit texture. So basically, that's just a texture for all of the little stickers in the cockpit, which, well, basically most of them just say some random stuff. So what I could extrapolate, you never be able to see that, but honestly it's even easier to just look at references and copy the thing than to just always think about what you're going to put there. So what I could read, I tried to put here. Everything else is just completely fictional. So this says, I have no idea what this warning is about, but it must be important. And I also need another sentence to match the shape of the text on the original. So yeah, I put stuff in there if I don't know what to put there. So there's this little rhyme, like I had no idea what the sticker said, so I wrote this little rhyme instead, or something like that. Basically, if nobody's ever gonna be able to see that, you're getting away with that. So yeah. From a distance, they look like the real thing, and it's probably enough for that. So everything else, because you find a lot more reference footage for the actual instrument panel of the plane. This is, of course, all based on the real thing as far as I could. So basically, I tried to replicate it as best as I could. And this is, of course, just the wooden floor, because yes, this plane has a wooden floor. So that's basically it for the cockpit. And if I quickly switch to the mech over here for a second again. So just to show the general concept. So you export this UDIM layout that you saw per tile to an image files. You can do it from Maya. So you basically have your UV layout as a reference in Photoshop. So you can start painting with that. So just a little word here on things. Usually, or nowadays, you would not necessarily use Photoshop to create your textures, but in the end, this is just a plane. So this is actually more or less a rather simple surface. So since this is a technical object, I find it usually easier because a lot of things. This is not an organic surface or something like that. There's not that many. So actually, on a organic surface, a lot of those UV islands will probably touch in areas where you can see it. So you pretty much have to do 3D paint, and I would if I had to kind of like brush over those areas and to not see any seams between the texture. The way this plane is basically set up, well, let me just quickly, so we can see that better, let me just quickly change that a little bit here. So Yeah, maybe like that. So, since most of these surfaces are pretty much islands that are taken apart where there's an actual panel line on the real plane, which is practical, there's really not that much area where there could be a seam. So a seam is when you maybe paint here and there's no panel line between these two parts. So if you paint in this area here, right here, so let me just paint there, in red, of course. So if I paint here, this paint blob is not gonna be continued here. So there's this hard border where this polygon ends. So I would have to paint here. If you have to do that a lot, go into a 3D painting application, because in the end, you just spend much more time fixing those seams than you would have just originally starting out in whatever Substance Painter or something like that, or Mari. So if you want to work in VFX, you pretty much use Mari for that. So yeah. So as I said, this is not much of a complicated surface. So I usually find it much more straightforward to work on these kinds of objects in Photoshop, because basically I can see my whole UV layout. I actually have some good orientation in here, what's what. I find it way faster. For example, if I take a look at the bump, so of course that's pretty easy with projection paint in 3D painting applications. So if you're in Mari, you'll be pretty fast. Pretty fast at setting up those rivets, and the kind of like advantages, you might paint the bump map basically at the same time as your diffuse map and anything like that. Or if you're using Substance Painter or a substance, any kind of substance, actually, you may be able to generate a procedural cool texture that you can use for all of your surfaces, or something like that. But really, on some assets, it's just not the case that you need that. So this is kind of like one of them. And in this case, I find it actually way faster to just go in here and just duplicate all those rivets in Photoshop and place them, because I can see which part of the plane I'm working at. So in this Photoshop file, there are these layers, so basically, or rather said folders. So basically everything that belongs to tile 1001 is in this one Photoshop file. So there's this diffuse color, which is the albedo, which is just this color information, and there are lots and lots of layers in there, and I named some of them and some of them I didn't, because honestly, once the texture is finished, I'm probably never gonna take a long look at the Photoshop file again. It's just for changing the name here, maybe. There's also this metallic mask, which is based on a diffuse color, so it would usually copy some shapes that I've painted in the diffuse up to the metallic mask, turn everything white or black, and that's that. That's the bump, as I said, and there's this engine stain layer. And even for these kinds of dirty things, as I said, if they are spanning across multiple UV islands that are actually connected, it's easier to do that in a painting application. But honestly, that's just some little brush painting and copy and paste in Photoshop. And those dirty things here, so these kind of like curvature mask things, are just basically the blurred version of the UV. So that's easy to do. So basically, that's the reason why I went with just doing it in Photoshop instead of spending some time. Because if you have to get your surfaces over to a 3D painting app, of course you have to export an FBX, Alembic, whatever. You have to import it, set it up, etc., etc. If in the end, and every texture painter will tell you that, it's easier for the texture artists to as I said, multi-layer painting, basically. So you paint the bump map at the same time as the dirt map and whatever. So if their work becomes easier, if you just export that thing out and they can paint in 3D, of course you do that. But in the end, as I said, this is a personal project. I didn't have to, so yeah. But as I said, there's always these problems with seams or something like that. So that could have happened here. But if you just pay attention to what you're doing, so basically the upper and lower part of this wing, for example, they're unwrapped differently. So there's this border right through here. So if I didn't pay attention in Photoshop to what I'm doing, this might be offset a little bit. So there might be a kind of gap. So this white part would start here. There might be this little gap right where the border is, and it might continue here. So of course you would see that. So you have to pay a little bit of attention to not having that. Of course, that's one of the things. So a lot of people I know also like to kind of like do their base of their texture in Photoshop and then switch over to a 3D painting package at a later stage. A lot of people I know just say Mari all the time. So it kind of depends on what you prefer really. I'm usually also a fan of the workflow of studying Photoshop, then going over to Mari. Actually, I also do some texture stuff in Nuke, actually. Especially if I need, yeah, kind of like masks or roller shapes or something like that. Or I want to keep a texture very, very procedural, or if it's based on a projection, I actually like to prepare some things in Nuke and then maybe take it over to Mari or something like that. So, yeah, Photoshop is just by chance. The thing how I did it in this case could have been totally different for a different asset. But yeah, there's lots of ways you can create your textures. What counts basically is that you get your needed masks and bump maps and diffuse color maps, or maybe specular roughness maps or anything like that. So the specular roughness on that plane, I could have mapped that, but this is procedurally generated on this asset. As I said, on a production, you might want to break that down into a texture map, but honestly, there's really no render time difference, and that thing actually renders fast on the GPU. On the CPU, it actually takes some time, but on the GPU, it's maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes a frame for good quality. So high quality, maybe 20 samples max. In front of black, so that takes longer with the scene around. But yeah, that's fast. So you can easily do that. So no need to bake things down. But as I've mentioned Mari a lot of times earlier, of course, if I had to fix some seams here or something like that, I would have taken that thing to Mari. So just for the people in my course, if you want to go into texturing a little more, and as I've mentioned, you already know this, most of it you use it. We do, of course, have access to the full production collective by the Foundry. So in the end, if you want to try out Mari for something like that, which is a 3D texture painting package, I'm just gonna drag that over here for a moment. This is Mari. So basically, I'm just gonna do a simple thing here because really that would take a lot of time to go into Mari. But basically, you have a 3D working space. You've imported your mesh. You have your UVs textures, and you can just start painting on it. Basically, so that's that. Just do it. Works. Kind of screwed up there, but really, just an example. So basically, you can just paint on that thing, or maybe if you just need to kind of like copy a thing. Let's say you want to get rid of a seam, or you want to use a copy stamp. You can do that. Whatever you like, just to show the principle. Mari is pretty much a standard in CG production. So if you want to take a look at it, this is an old version of Mari actually on this computer, but it was kind of like the computer that was free right now to just show that. So if you want to go into that, you have access, or you can ask for access to the full production collective. So just let me know. That's for the people in my course, of course, not everyone. So yeah, that's that. As I said, I'm not gonna go into that because really I didn't use it in this case, but you could have. So that's the textures that are loaded from file, and in the time lapse that I recorded, there's some. You can basically see me just painting, duplicating things and stuff. So I guess I can show that here for a moment. So really, I'm gonna upload these time lapse videos later, of course. So this is just the introduction to that series as well. So yeah, that's basically how I went about doing that. So closing that down. Let's get back to the Windows computer. And now it's finally time to open the HiRes shade and probably also an Arnold IPR. So let me just start with running the IPR.